Welcome to week 2 in the series of presentations on the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel.
Just a review quickly of the terminology, because I will be using it again today, especially. So for anybody who wasn't here last week, neurodevelopment is the term that refers to the brain's development and all of the systems and networks within it. A neurotype is a particular way of thinking, and there are different types of neurotypes. A neurotypical person is somebody who thinks in the ways that are expected within their culture. And so culture and society are set up to support those needs of a neurotypical person. I will also refer to this as the predominant neurotype or the neuronormative. A neurodivergent person is somebody whose brain operates in a way that is alternate to the neurotypical. So this, you can see there I've added in the neurodivergent umbrella. The neurodivergent umbrella is vast, the things that come underneath it. So there are a lot of different ways for us to be thinking about, is this information something that I'm presenting in a way that is accessible to other neurotypes, or is it set up just for the neurotypical? And neurodiversity is when there is a group of people with mixed neurotypes. So this includes neurotypical people. We cannot use neurodiversity interchangeably with neurodivergent. They are two different things. Something that I didn't mention last week is that the majority of neurodivergent people are multiply neurodivergent. So if you're autistic, you're very likely to be ADHD and dyslexic. This also goes with, and to have epilepsy. Epilepsy is very commonly co-occurring with autism. So there's a lot of overlap here, and we want to be thinking about the way that we're presenting information or the way that we're supporting somebody. Are we doing this in a way that is supportive of their neurotype or only of our neurotype? Just to clarify again about neurodiversity, it's like cupcakes. So vanilla is neurotypical. All the other flavors are neurodivergent. If I have a group of mixed flavors of cupcakes, that is a neurodiverse group of cupcakes. If I have a group of only autistic cupcakes, it is not neurodiverse because there are not multiple neurotypes within it. These are the 6 areas of development. And last week we talked about cognitive. This week we're talking about emotional. Next week we're going to be talking about sensory. And then we're going to have a recap week to try to pull it together a little bit and talk about how they interact a little bit more. This is what the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel looks like. It shows that there are 6 areas of neurodevelopment that make up a person's internal experience, and that's what we're interested in today, is trying to get to understanding a child's internal experience. We use this tool to gather the observable evidence or external behavior that we can see, and then we try to think, if we're seeing this behavior, what is the need that is going unmet that is driving this external behavior? As a note, the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel covers the same areas that an NDOS assessment covers, but they are not linked. They are not doing the same thing. An NDOS assessment is only looking at observable behavior and saying, does this have enough of the diagnostic criteria? What we're talking about is what somebody's lived experience is, and trying to find ways that are going to support them to live their life as comfortably and fully as possible in a world that is designed for a neurotype that is not theirs. Okay, so very important, the child's voice needs to be at the center of all discussions. If your young person is old enough to be included in the discussions about the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel, then they absolutely should be. They might not be able to actively participate. Young people, I find, can be can shut down a little bit when they're asked direct questions. So sometimes it's better just to let the information kind of sit around them so they have time to think about it. But they should always be engaged in whatever way is appropriate for them. The wheel is centered on the My World Triangle, which is the main tool of GERFEC. And I'm assuming that everybody will have a basic understanding of GERFEC, so I'm not going to go into it, but if you have a question about that, please put it in the chat and we can talk more about it later. Children and young people and their families must be fully included in discussions about what's happening in the child's world. So if there are challenges, if there's difficulties with getting your child to school, or your child leaving their bedroom or whatever, these things, professionals and families should be working together to talk about these things, not in isolation. So leading into that, this is a team activity. Completing this wheel is something that all of the people in a caring circle around a young person should be doing together, because we need to try to get a full picture of that young person's world. And what do we do? What are we capturing? We're taking down what we can observe of the young person's experience. So where they have strengths, where they have challenges, where it looks like they're wanting to be able to do something, but something else is keeping them from doing it. And then we're going to consider what the internal experience might be that is driving that external behavior. So if they're interrupting a lot, is it because they are afraid they're going to forget what they're talking about? Or is it because they don't trust the adults to come back to them because they don't feel that adults value their perspective? Okay, so there would be two very different support strategies for that, although the external behavior would look the same. Okay, so getting into the science of emotion. This is the limbic system, and the limbic system is what controls our emotional response to things. So it's connected to the brainstem, and it's made up of the amygdala, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, and the limbic cortex. And all of those parts play a different role in our emotional response. I'm going to focus today on the amygdala, because the amygdala is what controls our feelings of fear, anxiety, and anger. And when we're talking about the external behavior that we can observe, very frequently the behavior that we're observing is that of fear, anxiety, or anger. The amygdala is a purely survival response tool. So its job, literally, is to shut down the reasoning centers of our brain and to keep us focused on surviving. So it shuts down the prefrontal cortex, which is where all that wonderful cognitive stuff that we talked about last week is taking place. So we can't reason, we can't be logical, we can't think things through, like what are the consequences going to be? All we can do is respond. The fear, you'll have heard of this, the fear, flight, freeze, fawn response. Okay. So since it's shutting down the prefrontal cortex, it is shutting down our ability to reason, to plan, and to control our reaction to things. We talked a lot last week about executive function, and the prefrontal cortex is where executive function is based. So all of those things that we talked about last week as being really important for our daily management, for being able to get through life day to day, all of that gets shut down when our amygdala is activated. So the amygdala is at direct odds with the prefrontal cortex. This is known as amygdala hijack, when the amygdala takes over. So basically, you have stopped being a reasoning, functioning person, and you're a surviving person. And that's very important for us to know as the adults around a young person, that when they are in amygdala hijack, it is impossible for them to do anything but the innate thing in them that is telling them this is what they need to do to survive. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of an understanding of how amygdala hijack works, what makes up emotional development in terms of the more kind of academic understanding of this process? It's the process of learning to identify, express, and manage emotions. So as I just said about amygdala hijack, if that is turned off our reasoning center of our brain, we are not going to be able to manage our emotions. We're not going to be able to manage our behavior. It also includes learning how to empathize with others. Emotional development involves learning what feelings are, why we have them, how they happen, recognizing them in first ourselves and then in others, and then developing ways of effectively managing those feelings. So you can see how emotional development is a very complex thing. It isn't just that we learn how to do this like automatically. It really depends on how our brain is wired, how we're able to do these things. So, and what is it necessary for? It is necessary for self-awareness, for social awareness, emotional regulation, logical decision-making, being able to make logical and constructive decisions, and relationship building. So as I said already, it's a complex interaction, and that it's not just in the brain, it's also an interaction between the child's environment and their ongoing mental, physical, and social development. So as with all things in the brain, they all touch each other. They're all involved somehow in each other's development. The important thing is that emotional development is a staged process. We can't expect certain levels of competency in emotional regulation from a 3-year-old, for example, right? So it's a staged process. It's got many different facets, and it has a long-term impact on total well-being. So on overall mental well-being, emotional development is incredibly important. And so that's why we want to make sure that we're supporting a young person to develop these skills in a way that is appropriate for them, so that they don't end up in a difficult situation with their mental health. The early years of development are focused on intrapersonal emotional intelligence, so inside yourself. And then after that, it's so in between others, emotional intelligence. So intrapersonal is self-awareness and self-management, and this is being able to identify and understand our own feelings. First, it's very basic. So anger, happiness, the people that hang out inside Riley's head and inside out, the basic ones in the early years. And then in Inside Out 2, we get to the more complex ones, the later primary stage. That's where we're looking at frustration, disappointment, anxiety. We're working on managing our own emotions, our own strong emotions, and how we express those. So that's why we're supporting young people to understand that it's okay to feel upset, but it's not okay to hit, things like that. And regulating one's own behavior to different contexts. So, quick example, when my mom passed away some 8 years ago, my oldest child at the time had a very different emotional response to that than my nieces and my nephews, because he's autistic. And so I had to do a lot of explaining to my family about how his response to it was appropriate for him in that context. And so supporting him to be himself meant having to explain to others that because their behavior in one context looked one way, it doesn't mean that somebody else's behavior needs to look that way. So he was regulating his own behavior to that context in a way that was right for him. Okay, and then interpersonal is how we're aware of others and how we relate with others. So recognizing and understanding the emotional states of others and empathizing with them. This is a typical timeline. If you were to look up emotional development in Google, which I did, this is what you will find. And the important thing for us to remember in the context of what we're doing for the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel is that neurodivergent children are not likely to develop their emotional understanding and regulation skills on this timeline, because this timeline is for neurotypical children. So anytime you see a timeline of like average milestones or whatever, those are based on neurotypical milestones, not neurodivergent ones. It doesn't mean that our young people aren't capable of doing these things. It means they're going to do it on their own timeline because their brain is doing it differently. So we need to expect to see different things. There's not a deficit in capability. they're going to follow a different, equally valid path. And our job is to be aware of it so that we can support them along it. Again, importantly, a child's long-term mental well-being, their mental health, their relationships, their academic pursuits, all of these things are impacted by their experiences during their emotional development process. So it's critically important that their individual needs are identified and supported appropriately for them, not for what we want, but for what they need. Okay. And as with all aspects of neurodevelopmental development, children with neurodevelopmental differences often require explicit or more structured instruction for these skills. So I wanted to talk real quickly about myths versus facts here, and the myth that neurodivergent people are incapable of empathy. So I'm sure many of you will have heard this, and since we're talking about emotional development, and this is where we're learning about how to empathize with others, it seemed like an important thing to bring up right now. Neurodivergent people are incapable of empathy. Myth or fact? I'm going to answer for you. It's a myth. The facts are that neurodivergent empathizing just looks different to neurotypical empathizing or to the predominant neurotype of empathizing, but both are equally valid. So but the difficulty is neurotypical people expect to see one version of empathizing. And when they don't see that, they take that as the neurodivergent person not empathizing with them. Equally so, neurodivergent people don't understand why certain outward behaviors need to be happening in order to be considered to be empathizing. Because we know that we're empathizing. We feel it inside. We know that we're doing that. And so there is a disconnect that happens there. And this is called the double empathy problem. So the real problem here is that neurodivergent people are always expected to be the ones who change their behavior to meet the expectations of the predominant neurotype behavior norms. As a 48-year-old person, I can say in my life that has been 100% true. But predominant neurotype norms are not inherently better or more correct than neurodivergent norms. They're just different. So a lot of what we need to be doing is informing people around us that this isn't not empathizing, it just looks different to your empathizing, and also making it clear that both sides of that equation need to be giving each other understanding and acceptance. There is no one correct or appropriate way for someone to behave in relation to another person's emotional state. So I can see that somebody's upset. The way that I empathize with that might look different than what you would expect, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. Okay? So we should be giving unconditional positive regard to all children and the ways that they interact with the world. And I want to note here that the aim of using the wheel, the Neurodevelopmental Profile Wheel, is for us to gain perspective on internal experience. It is not for us to be identifying ways to tell neurodivergent children that their innate way of being is wrong or inappropriate. And it is certainly not for us to be forcing them to change their behavior to comply with the predominant neurotype norms. That is not what we're doing here. Okay, so what does emotional development look like? If a young person's emotional development needs support, you might see bigger or smaller reactions than you'd expect. So it might seem like something is a small problem, but they're very animated about how dramatically bad this is for them. Or in the case of my son, he wasn't weeping and broken down when at the death of a loved one. And so people thought that he wasn't experiencing grief, struggling to explain what they're feeling. Because if you remember, we have to be able to first identify an emotion before we can then be able to explain it. So if you're not understanding what this means, then you're not going to be able to explain it, or might just not even have the words for it. You might have a young person who's frequently saying their tummy hurts or feels funny, but they can't tell why. There could be confusion about why a family member is upset because the situation to them doesn't seem upsetting. You could have very frequently sudden external meltdowns, or they could go very significantly quiet, which is an internal shutdown. You could see them hiding in under a table in the classroom or in the bathroom or in a cupboard at home when visitors show up unexpectedly, or even if they were expected, but they weren't people that they necessarily feel a connection with, like they could be hiding. Another common one is physically going rigid, so becoming very, very stiff. And also things like always asking to stay home on days when there's PE, for example, or when there's assembly. So always wanting to go to school late when it's assembly day, something like that. So why might this be happening? There could be a lack of explicit explanation about a situation. So the adults might be assuming that a child knows what something means because a neurotypical child would probably pick that up, but they've never actually explained it. So, for example, to stand in line, if you in nursery say, okay, everybody stand in line, but you've never explained what that means, that you stand one in front of the other in order to make a single file line, a young person might not understand what that means. And so the more that happens, the more confused they are, the more emotional dysregulation you're going to see. There's a change to the expected schedule for which they're unprepared, and they don't have, they're going into amygdala hijack because the situation has changed. They're not feeling safe. They don't know what's going to happen. Sleep disturbances can cause this. So if they're not sleeping very well, we all know if we don't get a lot of sleep, we're a little less capable of being rational and our ability to control our emotions. And if there's long-term sleep disturbances from a developmental point of view, if they're not literally getting enough sleep, then their brain can't develop the way that it needs to. A misinterpretation of an event. So, for example, whenever somebody shouts, that means they're angry. But that isn't necessarily true because sometimes we shout to cover distance, but maybe they've over-applied that rule that shouting means anger. And so they could be getting upset because they think somebody is angry with them when really they're just trying to be heard. Dietary needs. So a lot of our young people have limited and restrictive diets, and that can result in being nutritionally deficient in a lot of ways. And our brains actually need a certain makeup of vitamins and minerals and all of those good things to develop appropriately, to help us be fully functioning people. You might have past traumatic experiences that are getting recalled when they're in certain situations, masking in certain situations and or environments. And we can talk more about masking in the question section. I didn't want to spend too much time on that because it's there are huge impacts of masking on mental well-being, but it's not really about so much the way the brain develops. Okay. Lack of prior planning for a new experience. So if you say, okay, we're going to go to do 10-pin bowling, but you've never explained what that means, then that could just be very anxiety inducing. And then alexithymia and interoception. Those are big terms. I'm going to spend some more time on them specifically because they deserve the time. But that's about being kind of disconnected from your internal senses. So, and this is a non-exhaustive list. It isn't like this is all there is related to alexithymia, or related to emotional development. Okay, so alexithymia and interoception. So I'm going to talk a lot more about this next week in detail, but the basics of this are that interoception is what tells us what's happening inside our body. So it's the connection between our brain and our body receptors. So that our body is picking up signals all the time, inside and outside, and skin, hearing, all of the senses. We're picking up this information. And interoception is what allows us to interpret that information to turn it into, oh, I'm feeling like this. And that is obviously a very important skill for, being able to interpret that correctly for your needs in order to be able to regulate yourself to your situation and to feel safe and to feel comfortable. Alexithymia is when we're kind of disconnected from that interoception. And that happens a lot of the time because you can just have a misunderstanding about what your signals mean. So maybe you're misinterpreting hunger for thirst or something like that. Or maybe you're actually really tired and now you're feeling cold, but it's actually that you're tired, right? So kind of a mishmash of those receptors, the information coming in. But also that disconnection happens because very frequently we tell our young people that what they're feeling is wrong. So they'll say, I'm feeling cold right now. And you'll say, no, actually you're feeling tired. And because something like I was talking about the bigger or the smaller reactions, they might have a really big reaction to something. And we'll say, you're overreacting. There's nothing that important happening right now. You're fine. And it's not that we're being dismissive so much as to us, we're seeing a bigger perspective, or we're trying to help them to realize that actually what they need to do is go to sleep. But when you hear enough of that messaging, you start to distrust what your body is telling you. So we're not supporting them to understand what their body is actually telling them and to interpret it in a way that is going to help them be able to self-manage that. We're telling them you can't trust yourself, which then has bigger consequences. So we'll talk more about that in sensory next week, but you can see how this will impact emotional development, because if you're always being told that what you're feeling is wrong, it's going to make it very hard for you to be able to regulate and understand your own emotions. Okay. So all of this information that we have just talked about, where are we putting what it looks like and all of that? We're putting that into this neurodevelopmental profile wheel. This is the emotional section of the form. Again, these questions are just starting points to try to give you an idea of the kinds of thing you might want to be capturing. There will be lots of crossover. So as I've just talked about with sensory, you might be noticing they don't seem to know the difference between being cold or being sleepy. You could put that in sensory. You could also put that in emotional. And so we're just trying to capture that external behavior that we're able to observe, put it into the form so that later on we can try to answer the questions about why might this be happening. And we want details here. These aren't yes and no questions. This isn't, so I know they're literally yes and no questions, but we want you to expand upon that in order to use this most effectively. So does the child recognize emotions in themselves and others? The answer to that is probably they do in themselves sometimes, but I've noticed when they're in school, sometimes they're not able to tell when they're starting to get upset, right? Like it's a detailed answer, not just yes or no. Okay, so how can we help? So because this is probably the most important part, we can fill in all of these things and then in the form, and then what we have to do is sit down together with the rest of the people in the caring circle and say, what can we do now to put supports in place to help this young person develop their emotional development? Okay, so always we ask the young person what they want and what they need. So they may want to be able to go to school, but they're not able to because of the environment, the sensory overwhelm or something. But it's really making them feel worthless because they're not able to go to school. So what they want is to be able to go to school. Then we need to find ways to make that happen. What they want is at the center. What they need is at the center. Then we're going to proceed with neurodiversity affirming practice. And you'll see there, it's broken down into the different aspects of what that means. And mostly what it means is we listen to the young person, we believe what they're telling us, and then we act on it. So we don't tell them that they're wrong about what they're telling us they need. Okay. I'm going to also highlight the part there that's be informed by neurodivergent voices, because when we're dealing with neurodevelopmental differences, for the most part, there is a conflict between the medical diagnostic perspective and the actual lived experience perspective. And there is important stuff to understand in the medical model, but in terms of supporting a young person, we need to be informed by lived experience to help a young person develop as a person, not as a collection of traits. Okay, so what else can we do? It's important to remember that when we support young people, we are not telling them what or how to feel. We're going to help them find that for themselves, because they need to learn those skills so that they can manage the process for themselves in the future, and so that they can advocate for themselves in the future, so that they can know that it is perfectly valid for them to say, no, that is not how I'm feeling. This is what I need. We need them to feel confident in their ability to do that. So we're going to be strength focused rather than deficit correcting in our support approach. We're not saying that's the wrong way of doing this. How about we do it this way? That might feel better. Ensure there are trusted adults around the young person who are attuned to their needs and that everybody is on the same page. That's the providing the consistent approach in all areas of the child's world. So that's home, school, activities, extended family, that everybody is operating with a consistent approach to supporting this young person. We're going to validate their internal experience. I can't stress that one enough. We're going to listen to them and we're going to believe them. We're going to demonstrate how to get curious to understand oneself. And that's something that I'll talk more about next week with sensory too. Model how you acknowledge your emotions when you move into planning to respond. So if I have a difficult situation come up for me and I'm feeling conflicted inside, as much as possible, I try to talk about that out loud so that my children can see me doing it, because they need to know that it is a process, that it isn't, and it's an internal process, right? For most of us, we're just doing it in our head and we're like, okay, this is this factor and I need to take, we're doing that in our head, but that's not actually showing a young person who needs explicit understanding how to go about doing that. So as much as possible, take these learning opportunities. Very importantly, we can change the environment, the physical and the emotional, to reduce unnecessary stressors. There is, Dr. Ross Green has, oh no, it's Dr. Luke Bearden, sorry. So Dr. Luke Bearden has a formula that is specifically for his work. It's autism plus environment equals outcome. And we can, while that is in the context of his work, that is very true. I also feel like we can expand that a little bit to neurodivergence plus environment equals outcome. So we're not going to change the neurodivergence. That's how the brain is wired. We're not changing that. We can support them to be able to learn skills that are going to help them manage things and advocate for themselves, but we're not going to change how their brain is wired. So The only thing that we can physically change, practically change, is the environment. And that is both the physical environment, the room that they're sitting in, the lighting that's in that room, all of those things, the people who are around them, and their emotional environment. So what kind of supports are we putting in place to help them understand themselves, to accept themselves, to believe themselves? And that will help us reduce the unnecessary stressors. Providing predictable routines. Practicing co-regulation. There is, for some reason, co-regulation is treated like a bad word or something, but that's how we demonstrate how to handle these situations. We say, I'm really upset. What would make me feel good right now would probably be a hug from you. Can I have a hug from you? And then you're showing them how to do that so that when a young person then is upset, they can say to you, can I have a hug? Right? Like we're helping each other. There's nothing wrong with helping each other. And ask yourself, what can I do differently to support my child? So, this is an example scenario. So in this scenario, an 8-year-old child says every school day morning that they have an uncomfortable feeling. The child also says this before going to their Cubs meeting each week. They are confused about what it means, and they haven't yet recognized the pattern to their experience. So, what does neurodiversity affirming practice tell us to do? Do we, and you can use the chat box for this, do we, assert what it means and tell them what to do? That means you're anxious, you don't need to be, everything is fine. Or B, do we validate their experience and encourage them to be curious? I can see how that would be confusing. When does the feeling go away? So answers in the chat box. That is correct. It is B. It is B all the way. One of my favorite expressions, every day of the week and twice on Sunday, it is B. Okay? We need to help them navigate that feeling and come to the conclusion themselves, because otherwise they don't have ownership over it. Here's an example support tool. So the stress bucket analogy, some of you may have heard this before already. The bucket is like where our stress gets stored. And so stressful events fill up our bucket. And then when it gets over full, it starts to spill out. And that's when then we're having emotional dysregulation. The size of our bucket is different. The size of the bucket is different for everybody, our capacity. And so particularly with neurodivergent people, I always picture the stress bucket as not only is the capacity different, but also there's dents and dings and maybe a couple holes. So our capacity is very different. And there are ways that we have that will help us feel better, that will help us relieve some of that pressure in positive ways. So that's what this little spigot there is. So we need to understand what contributes to our feelings of stress and anxiety so that we can plan how to take action to change those things. That's the point of the stress bucket. And you can see there's an example tool there where you can say, what are the things that add stress to my bucket? What are the things that help me actively manage that stress? There are different versions of this tool. I put those links there so you'll be able to use them when you get the presentation. But this is just one practical support tool that we can use to have a kind of constructive conversation with our young people about what is causing them to feel overwhelmed and how they can manage it. Not us telling them how they're going to manage it, but working with them to help them identify it for themselves. These are other support resources, and you can see now why I said to you that it was important that the links all work, because there's a lot there. And I recognized as I was doing this that a lot of these links say that they're related to autism, but they're not autism exclusive, if you see what I mean. It's just that the people who are working in the sphere of affirming autism support have done a lot of this work, because we are, as an autistic person, I can say so very regularly, I'm trying to come up with a word that is polite. We're ignored. We're disbelieved a lot of the time about what we're saying we feel and what we believe. So there's a lot of work in these areas from autistic activists. And if there is anybody that I can recommend to you for information or practical supports for pretty much anything related to neurodivergence, it would be Autism Level Up. There's also Reframing Autism has some great information, particularly here under the specific tools. And Kelly Mahler there under emotional regulation, but I'll talk more about her next week when we're in sensory. She is fabulous, Kelly Mahler. She's an OT who works very expansively within the area of interoception and understanding what that means and how that actually impacts everything, how our ability or our inability to connect with our internal sense, either because of societal training or just disconnect within the signals, how that impacts swaths of our lives, like large swaths. So she does great work. So specific tools that you can be using. You can use social stories and comic strip conversations, and there are examples of those on the Pines website. Scripting can be very useful for self-regulation in situations, and this is where you kind of come up with if this happens in this situation, then I'll do this, and helping a young person work their way through that so that they can feel in control of a situation. That one there, that's under Teachers Pay Teachers. That's for M at Neurowild, and Neurowild is my guru of everything. So she's a speech and language pathologist, and she has amazing resources. So M at Neurowild all the way. There are stimming aids that can help you stay regulated if you're feeling like you're starting to get overwhelmed, maybe just having some pressure, squeezing something that can help you to calm down the amygdala so that you can get back into your prefrontal cortex. In terms of the dietary things that I mentioned, there are specific supports and aids around that. We're very lucky to have a specialist dietitian based at the Pines, Dave Rex, and he is so smart about all of the ways that our dietary intake is impacting our ability to manage life. And that's for all neurodivergence. So he's the specialist dietitian. You can, there's a link there to find out how to contact him. And then there's, vitamins, and there's lots of information out there. I would just caution you to be making sure that the resources that you're using are affirming resources and not the kinds of things that say, like, if you take this, it'll cure your autism or cure your ADHD. I get so many things on Facebook lately telling me how to cure ADHD, and I just want to scream. The emotional thermometers, these are worksheets at Awesome Training, and Awesome Training, they're based in Ireland. They are also fabulous. The emotional thermometers are exceptionally useful. It's kind of like the zones of regulation, which you may have experience with. Autism Level Up also has a lot of thermometer type things that are really useful. There are things that make me feel calm. There are Twinkle worksheets, and I spelled it right this week. There's sleep supports and aids. The Pines Highland has on their website, there's a sleep section. I would mention specifically that sleep is something that is exceptionally important to development, and also one of the things that our young people tend to struggle with the most. And there are lots of reasons for that. It's not just one thing. So weighted blankets can help if it's a physical thing they're needing. Writing stuff down to get worries out of their head can help if it's that they're ruminating. There are lots of different aspects to that. There isn't just one thing that's going to fix that. And of course, there's medical stuff that you can do, like melatonin, which is not actually a medicine. It's a hormone, and neurodivergent brains are known to be lacking in melatonin, and melatonin is the thing that lets us know that it's time to go to sleep. And interoception learning. So I've put those links there. for interoception. The one is Kelly Mahler and the other one is NeuroWild. And they really, interoception is what we need to spend a lot of time on. Okay, so our key takeaways today. Emotional development happens in stages. First, intrapersonal emotional development happens, and then interpersonal emotional development. It impacts self-awareness. The spacing is off again. I'll fix it before. I worked so hard to make it be perfect this week. Self-awareness, social awareness, relationship building, emotional regulation, executive function, and decision-making. And emotional development support must be clear and explicit, child-centered, affirming and strengths-focused, consistent, validating, and curious. We're trying to encourage what might be causing that, do you think? So that always that we're coming back to that curiosity about understanding oneself, believing oneself, and supporting oneself. We use the wheel to gain perspective on a neurodivergent child's internal experience, not to force them to change their behavior to comply with predominant neurotype norms. So if we have a little bit of question time now when once I've wrapped this up. If you're needing support, though, if you have more information that you think you might need, you can contact Thriving Families. That's our contact information there. Or you can call Just Ask on Tuesdays and Thursdays between 1 and 4. Do not struggle on alone thinking that this is something you have to work out for yourself. Co-regulation is valid. So we can help each other. And that's that. So thank you very much.